What are you doing? Yeah. Hi.
Hello, welcome to Every Storytime. How are you doing today? Today we are going to be reading Dragon's Song again. But first the Bible. Then we're going to be doing the synopsis with Kim, I think. And we are also going to be sending the thing from the Bible, which is right there. And if anyone joins, please post a comment so we know who's on.
Okay, and I apologize yesterday. I know we had a lot of extra people on that we weren't used to. I actually posted it on my actual page. I even had somebody, hi Kimmy. I actually even had somebody at work this morning because I had to work today. Obviously, that's why I'm still in my Army shirt. Ask me about it, and I had to explain what we do every night and why we do it. So, okay, so now we start, and so it's time to go to the bathroom. Kimmy, like it never ends. This is what we deal with, like constant, basically from about 6 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 3 o'clock in the morning, until. Do you want to talk about 3 o'clock in the morning? No. Oh, okay.
So maybe like.
That's when walking zombies. Oh, I want to eat your brains. Or churros cereal while I'm watching YouTube.
I don't eat churros cereal.
I want to eat your churros cereal.
Hey, next time, prior planning.
Yeah.
We had all this time.
Yep. Okay, so are we ready now? Hi, Kimmy. Nice wink there, Kimmy. Okay, so Colossians 2, as I have already posted. And I didn't turn the page. We did read Colossians 1 yesterday, right? Okay, Colossians 2. For I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you and for those at Laodicea, and for all who have not seen me face to face, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. For though I am absent in body, yet I am with you in spirit, rejoicing to see your good order and the firmness of your faith in Christ. Don't make me pull this collar over one more time. Sorry, I got distracted. I'm going to continue Colossians chapter 2 now. Therefore, as you receive Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. And you have been filled in him who is the head of all rule and authority. In him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are the shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. I want to just point out one really quick thing. I hope Granny Bear's still there. I see one person watching. Okay. I've been listening to this podcast. It's called The History of Christian Theology, and it's really, really interesting. They go through lots and lots of early, well, so far they're still doing early Christian documents. Athanasius, actually, they're not to Athanasius yet, but they just finished doing Clement of Alexandria, which is a 2nd century early patristic father. Anyway, long story long. It is commonly believed that Christians worshipped on the Sabbath until basically Constantine, Council of Nicaea or whatever, and that Constantine, being the emperor of Rome, changed a lot of Christianity, mostly for the worse. And while I'm not necessarily negating that he did change Christianity, this thing right here, the Sabbath, there it right is in the Bible. It says, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. And like early in the 1st century, there's lots of early patristic fathers who actually mentioned that they started celebrating or worshiping on the Lord's Day, which they very quickly moved from Saturday to Sunday. Definitely in the 1st century, Polycarp and Clement of Rome and some of those early people. So sorry, long story long, but I do highly recommend that History of Christian Theology podcast if you have the ability to listen to it. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, who is very patiently waiting for me to finish rambling. So I will go now.
Yes, 21 years. Okay, hold on. What? I haven't been waiting 21 years for you to stop rambling. I just said.
There is nothing wrong with me making a comment on the Bible passage that I read, by the way. I just want to say that. And if it just happens to be relevant to the podcast that I'm listening to, all the better, because maybe it gives me some kind of a knowledge of what I'm actually talking about. No, I don't think that I'm doing anything bad.
No, you're not doing anything bad.
You're like accusing me.
I am not accusing. I just said 21 years, that's all. Okay, no, only 20 years of having kids. Oh, Lord, I feel so old. Okay, Dragon Song, chapter 4. And if we read 2 chapters tonight, it will be 30 pages. So I have my trusty lemon and honey. And if I have to stop to tell you to be quiet, let me just say there will be consequences. Okay, that's it. That's your one chance. All right, chapter 4. Black, blacker, blackest, and the cold beyond frozen things. Where is between, when there is not to life but fragile dragon's wings? Despite her mother's care in cleaning the wound, Menelie's hand was swollen by evening, and she was feverish with pain. One of the old aunts sat with her, placing cool cloths on her head and face, and gently crooning what she thought would be a comforting song. The notion was misplaced since, even in her delirium, Manoli was aware that music had now been forbidden her. She became more irritated and restless. Finally, Mavi dosed her liberally with Felis juice and wine, and she fell into a deep slumber. This proved to be a blessing because the hand had so swollen that it was obvious some of the pack-tail slime had gotten in the bloodstream. Mavi called in one of the other hold women deft in such matters. Luckily for Manoli, they decided to release the coarse stitches and allow better drainage of the infection. They kept Manoli heavily dosed and hourly changed the hot poulticing of her hand and arm. Pack-tail infection was pernicious, and Mavi was dreadfully afraid that they might have to remove Menelie's arm to prevent a further spread. She was constantly by her daughter's side, an attention that Menelie would have been surprised and gratified to receive. But she remained unconscious. Fortunately, the angry red lines faded on the girl's swollen arm on the evening of the fourth day. The swelling receded, and the edges of the terrible gash assumed the healthier color of healing flesh. Throughout her delirium, Menelie kept begging them to let her play just once more, just once again, pleading in such a pitiful tone that it all but broke Mavi's heart to realize that unkind fortune had made that impossible. The hand would always be crippled, which was as well, since some of the new Harper's questions were provoking Giannis. Elgin very much wanted to know who had drilled the youngsters in their teaching songs and ballads. At first thinking that Menelie had been nowhere near as skilled as everyone had assumed, Giannis had told Elgin that a fosterling had undertaken the task and he'd returned to his own hold just prior to the Harpers' arrival. Whoever did has the markings of a good harper then, Elgin told his new holder. Old Petrion was a better teacher than most. The praise unexpectedly disturbed Giannis. He couldn't retract his words, and he didn't want to admit to Elgin that the person was a girl. So Giannis decided to let matters stand. No girl could be a harper, and anyway the road turned. Easton, move. Menelie was too old now to be in any of the classes, and he'd see that she was busy with other things until she came to think of her playing as some childish fancy. At least she hadn't disgraced the hold. He was, of course, sorry that the girl had cut herself so badly, and not entirely because she was a good worker. Still, it kept her out of the Harper's way until she forgot her silly tuning. Once or twice, though, while Menelie was ill, he wished her clear, sweet voice in countersong the way she and Petrion used to sing. Yet he dismissed the matter from his mind. Women had more to do than sit around singing and playing. There were exciting doings in the holds and weirs, according to Elgin's private report to him. Troubles, too, deep and worrisome enough to take his mind from the minor matter of a wounded girl. One of the questions that Harper Elgin often posted concerned the Seaholds' attitude toward their wire Bendon. Elgin was curious as to how often they came in contact with the old-timers at Ysta Weir. How did Giannis and his holders feel about dragon riders, about the weir leaders and weir women of Bendon? If they resented dragon men going in on search for young boys and girls of the holds and craft halls to become dragon riders, had Giannis or any of his hold ever attended a hatching? Giannis answered the questions with the fewest possible words, and at first this seemed to satisfy the harper. Half-circles always tied to Bendon Weir, even before Threadfall. We know our duty to the weir, and they do theirs by us. Not a single borrow in thread since the fall started 7 or more terms ago. Old-timers? Well, with half-circle beholden to Bendon Weir, we don't much see any of the other weirs, not as the people in Kiroon or Nurat might when the fall overlaps 2 weirs' boundaries. Very glad we were that the old-timers had come between so many hundreds of turns to help our time out. Dragon men are welcome any time at Half Circle. Come spring and fall, the women are here anyway, gathering sea beach plums and marshberries, grasses, and the like. Welcome to all they want. Never met weir woman, Lessa. I see her on her Queen Ramoth in the sky after a fall now and then. Weir leader Falar is a fine fellow. Search, do they find any likely lad at half circle? It will be to our honor, and he's our leave to go. Although the problem had never worried the sea holder, no one from half circle had answered a search. Which was as well, Giannis thought privately. If a lad happened to be chosen, every other lad in the hold would take to grumbling that he should have been picked. And on the seas of Pern, you had to keep your mind and your work, not on dreams. Bad enough to have those pesky fire lizards appearing now and then by the dragon stones, but as no one could get near enough to the stones to catch a fire lizard, no harm was done. If the new harper found his holder an unimaginative man, hard-working and hidebound, he had been well prepared for it by his training. His problem was that he must provoke a change, subtle at first, in what he found. For Master Harper Rubbington wanted each of his journeymen to get every holder and craftmaster to think beyond the needs of their own lands, hall, and people. Harpers were not simply tellers of tales and singers of songs. They were arbiters of justice, confidants of holders and craftmasters, and molders of the young. Now more than ever, it was necessary to alter hidebound thinking, to get everyone, starting with the young and working on the old, to consider more of Pern than the land they kept thread-free of the problems of their particular area. Many old ways needed shaking up, revising. If Falar of Bendenweir hadn't done some shaking up, if Lessa hadn't made her fantastic ride back 400 turns to bring up the massive 5 weirs of dragon riders, Pern would be writhing under thread, with nothing green and growing left on the surface. The weirs had profited, and so had Pern. Similarly, the holds and crafts would profit if they only were willing to examine new ideas and ways. Half Circle could expand, Elgion thought. The present quarters were becoming cramped. The children had told him that there were more caves in the adjacent bluffs, and the dock caverns could accommodate more than the 30-odd craft now anchored to safety there. By and large, though, Elgion was rather relieved at his situation, since this was his first post as harper. He had his own well-furnished apartments in the hold, enough to eat, though the diet of fish might soon pall on a man accustomed to red meat, and the seaholders were generally pleasant people, if a little dour. Only one thing puzzled him. Who had drilled the children so perfectly? Old Petrion had sent word to the harper that there was a likely song-maker at Half Circle, and he had included 2 scored melodies that had greatly impressed the master harper. Petrion had also said that there'd be some difficulty in the sea-hold about the song-maker. A new harper, for Petrion had known that he was dying when he wrote the master harper, would have to go carefully. This was a hold that had kept much to itself and observed all the old ways. So Elgian had kept his counsel on the matter of the songmaker, certain that the lad would make himself known. Music was hard to deny, and based on the 2 songs Elgian had been shown, this lad was undeniably musical. However, if the chap were a fosterling and away from the hold, he'd have to wait his return. Elgian had soon managed to visit all the different smaller holds of the half-circle palisade and gotten to know most people by name. The young girls would flirt with him and gaze at him with sorrowful eyes and sighs when he played in the evenings at the great hall. There was really no way in which Elgian would have realized that Meneley was the person he wanted. The children had been told by the sea-holder that the harper would not like to know that they'd been drilled by a girl, so they were not to bring disgrace on the hold by telling him. After Meneley cut her hand so badly, it was rumored that she'd never use it again, so everyone was told that it would be heartless to ask her to sing in the evenings. When Meneley was well of the infection and her hand healed, but obviously stiff, no one was thoughtless enough to remind her of her music. She herself stayed away from the singing in the great hall, and since she could not use her hand well, and so many occupations in the hold required too, she was frequently sent away in the day to gather greens and fruits, usually alone. If Mavi was perplexed by the quietness and passivity of her youngest child, she put it down to the long and painful recovery, not to loss of her music. Mavi knew that all manner of pain and trouble could be forgotten in time, and so she did her best to keep her daughter occupied. Mavi was a very busy woman, and Menely kept out of the way. Gathering greens and fruit suited Menely perfectly. It kept her out in the open and away from the hold, away from people. She would have her morning drink, bread and fish quietly in the great kitchen when everyone was dashing around to feed the men of the hold, either going out to fish or coming back in from a night's sailing. Then Menely would wrap up a fish roll and take one of the nets or skin slings. She'd tell the old aunt in charge of the pantry that she was going out for whatever it was, and since the old aunt had a memory like a sea net, she wouldn't remember that Menely had done the same thing the day before or realized that she would do the same the day after. When spring was fully warming the air and making the marshes brilliant with green and blossom color, spider claws began to walk in from the sea to lay their eggs in the shallower cove waters. As these plump shellfish were a delicacy in themselves, besides adding flavor to every dish when dried or smoked, the young people of the hold, Menely with them, were sent off with traps, spades, and nets. Within 4 days, the nearby coves were picked clear of spider claws, and the young harvesters had to go further along the coast to find more. With thread due to fall any time, it was unwise to stray too far from the hold, so they were told to be very careful. There was another danger that concerned the sea holder considerably. Tides had been running unusually high and full this term, much higher water in the harbor, and they'd not get the two big sloops in or out of the cavern unless they unsteeped the mast. Due notice was taken of the high tide lines, and there was much shaking of heads when it was observed that the line was two full hands higher than ever before recorded. The lower caverns of the hold were checked against possible seepage. Bags of sand were filled and placed along the lower portions of the sea walls around the harbor. A good storm, and the causeways would be awash. Giannis was concerned enough to have a long chat with old uncle to see if he remembered anything from his earlier and clearer days of sea holding. Old uncle was delighted to talk and ranted on about the influences of the stars, but when Giannis, Elgian, and two of the other old shipmasters had sifted through what he'd said, it was not to any great increase in knowledge. Everyone knew that the two moons affected the tides, not the three bright stars in the sky. They did, however, send a message about these curious tides to Eigen Hold, to be forwarded with all possible speed to the main Seacraft's hold at Fort. Giannis didn't want to have his biggest boats caught out in the open, so he kept careful check of the tides, determined to leave them within the dock cavern if the tide rose another hand higher. When the youngsters went out to gather spider claws, they were told to keep their eyes open and report back anything unusual, especially new high water marks on the coves. Only thread deterred the more adventurous lads from using this as an excuse for ranging far down the coast. Menely, who preferred to explore the more distant places alone, mentioned thread to them as often as possible. Then, after the next threadfall, when everyone was sent out for spider claws, Menely made certain that she got a head start on the boys, making good use of her long legs. It was fine to run like this, Menely thought, putting yet another rise between her and her nearest pursuers. She altered her stride for uneven ground. It wouldn't do to break an ankle now. Running was something even a girl with a crippled hand could do well. Menely closed her mind to that thought. She'd learned the trick of not thinking about anything. She counted. Right now, she counted her strides. She ran on, and her eyes sweeping ahead of her to save her feet. The boys would never catch her now, but she was running for the sheer joy of the physical effort, chanting a number to each stride. She ran until she got a stitch in her side, and her thighs felt the strain. She slowed, turning her face into the cool breeze blowing offshore, inhaling deeply of its freshness and sea odors. She was somewhat surprised to see how far she had come down the coast. The dragonstones were visible in the clear air, and it was only then that she recalled the little queen. Unfortunately, she also remembered the tune she'd made up that day, the last day, Menely now realized, of her trusting childhood. She walked on, following the line of the bluffs, peering down to see if she could spot new high water marks on the stone escarpments. Tide was halfway in now, Menely decided, and yes, she could see the lines of the sea debris from the last tide. in some places right up against the cliff face, and this had been a cove with a deep beach. A movement above, a sudden blotting of the sun, made her gaze upward. A sweep-rider. Knowing perfectly well that he couldn't see her, she waved vigorously anyhow, watching the graceful glide as the pair dwindled into the distance. Sella had told her one evening, when they were preparing for bed, that Elgian had flown on dragons several times. Sella had given a quiver of delighted terror, vowing that she wouldn't have the courage to ride a dragon. Privately, Manoli thought that Sella wouldn't likely have the opportunity. Most of Sella's comments and probably thoughts were centered on the new harper. Sella was not the only one Menely knew. If Menely could think how silly all the Hold girls were being about Harper Elgian, it didn't hurt so much to think about harpers in general. Again, she heard the fire lizards before she saw them. Their excited chirpings and squeals indicated something was upsetting them. She dropped to a crouch and crept to the edge of the bluff, overlooking the little beach. Only there wasn't much beach left, and the fire lizards were hovering over a spot on the small margin of sand almost directly below her. She inched up to the edge, peering down. She could see the queen darting at the incoming waves as if she could stop them with her violently beating wings. Then she'd streak back, out of Meneley's line of sight, while the rest of the creatures kept milling and swooping, rather like frightened herd beasts, running about aimlessly when wild weirs circled their herd. The queen was shrieking at the top of her shrill little voice, obviously trying to get them to do something. Unable to imagine what the emergency could be, Meneley leaned just a little further over the edge. The whole lip of the cliff gave way. Clutching wildly at sea grasses, Meneley tried to prevent her fall, but the sea grass slipped cuttingly through her hands, and she slid over the edge and down. She hit the beach with a force that sent a shock through her body, but the wet sand absorbed a good deal of the impact. She lay where she'd fallen for a few minutes, trying to get her breath into her lungs and out again. Then she scrambled to her feet and crawled away from the incoming wave. She looked up the side of the bluff, rather daunted by the fact that she'd fallen a dragon length or more. And how was she going to climb back up? But as she examined the cliff face, she could see that it was not so unscathable and as she'd first thought. Almost straight up, yes, but pocked by ledges and holds, some fairly large. If she could find enough foot and handholds, she'd be able to make it. She dusted the sand from her hands and started to walk towards one end of the little cove to begin systematic search of the easiest way up. She'd gone only a few paces when something dove at her, screeching in fury. Her hands went up to protect her face as the little queen came diving down at her. Now Meneley recalled the curious behavior of the fire lizards. The little queen acted as if she were protecting something from Meneley as well as the encroaching sea, and she looked about her. She was within a handspans of stepping into a fire lizard clutch. That's like a nest of eggs. Daniel, that's enough. Get him away and get back in bed. It's bedtime. Put the bunny away and get in bed. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I wasn't looking. Don't be mad at me, Melanie cried as the little fire lizard came at her again. Please stop. I won't hurt them. To prove her sincerity, Meneley backtracked to the far edge of the beach. There she had to duck under a small overhang. When she looked around, there wasn't a sign of the little queen. Melanie's relief was short-lived, for how was she to find a way up the cliff if the little fire lizard kept attacking her every time she approached the eggs? Mentally hunched down, trying to get comfortable in her cramped refuge. Maybe if she kept away from the eggs? Mentally peered up the cliff directly above her. There were some likely-looking holes. She eased herself out the far side, keeping an eye on the clutch, basking in the hot sun, and reached for the first ledge. Immediately, the fire lizard came at her. Oh, leave me alone. Ow, go away. I'm trying to. The fire lizard's talons had racked her cheek. Please, I won't hurt your eggs. The little queen's next pass just missed Melanie, who ducked back under the ledge. Blood oozed from the long scratch, and Meneley dabbed at it with the edge of her tunic. Haven't you got any sense? Meneley demanded of her own invisible attacker. What would I want with your silly eggs? Keep 'em. I just want to get home. Can't you understand? I just want to go home. Maybe if I sit very still, she'll forget about me, Melanie thought and pulled her knees up under her chin. But her toes and elbows protruded from under the overhang. Suddenly, a bronze fire lizard materialized above the clutch, squeaking worriedly. Menelly saw the queen swooping to join him. So the queen must have been on the top of the ledge, waiting, just waiting for Menelly to break cover. To think I made up a pretty tune about you, Menelly thought as she watched the two lizards hovering over the eggs. The last tune I ever made up, and you're ungrateful, that's what you are. Despite her discomfort, Menelly had to laugh. What an impossible situation, held under a cramped ledge by a creature no bigger than her forearm. For the sound of her at the sound of her laughter, the two fire lizards disappeared. Frightened, were they? Of laughter? A smile wins more than a frown, Mavi was fond of saying. Maybe if I keep laughing, they'll know I'm friendly, or get scared away long enough for me to climb up, saved by a laugh. Menelly began to chuckle in earnest, for she had also seen that the tide was coming in rather quickly. She eased out of her shelter, flung the carry sack over her shoulder, and started to climb. But it proved impossible to chuckle and climb. She needed breath for both. Abruptly, both the little queen and the bronze were back to harry her, flying at her head and face. The fragile-looking wings were dangerous when used as a weapon. No longer laughing, Menelly ducked back under the ledge, wondering what to do next. If laughter had startled them, what about a song? Maybe if she gave that pair a chorus or a tune, they'd let her go. It was the first time she'd sung since she'd seen the lizards, so her voice so her voice sounded rough and uncertain. Well, the lizards would know what she meant, she hoped. So she sang the saucy little song to no one. Well, so much for that notion, Menelly muttered under her breath, which makes the lack of interest in your singing absolutely unanimous. No audience? Not a fire lizard's whisker in sight? As far as she could, Menelly slipped from her shelter and came face to face for a split second with two fire lizard faces. She ducked down, and they evidently disappeared because when she cautiously peered again, the ledge they'd been perched was empty. She had the distinct impression that their expressions had registered curiosity and interest. Look, if wherever you are, you can hear me, will you stay there and let me go? Once I'm on the top of the cliff, I'll serenade you till the sun goes down. Just let me get up there. She started to sing a dutiful dragon song as she once again emerged from the refuge. She was about 5 steps upward when the queen fire lizard emerged with help. With squeaks and squeals, she was driven back down. She could even hear claws scraping on the rock above her. She must have quite an audience by now when she didn't need one. Cautiously, she looked up, met the fascinated whirling of 10 pairs of eyes. Look, a bargain, one long song, and then let me up the cliff. Is that agreed? The fire lizard's eyes whirled. Menelly took it that the bargain was made and sang. Her voice started a flutter of surprised and excited chirpings, and she wondered if by any possible freak they actually understood what she was singing about. Grateful holds honoring dragon riders. By the last verse, she eased out into the open, awed by the sight of the queen fire lizard and 9 bronzes, entranced by her performance. Can I go now? She asked and put one hand on the ledge. The queen dived for her hand, and Melanie snatched it back. I thought we'd struck a bargain. The queen chirped piteously, and Menelly realized that there had been no menace in the queen's action. She simply wasn't allowed to climb. You don't want me to go? Melanie asked. The queen's eyes seemed to glow more brightly. But I have to go. If I stay, the water will come up and drown me. And Melanie accompanied her words with explanatory gestures. Suddenly, the queen let out a shrill cry, seemed to hold herself midair for a moment, and then, her bronzes in close pursuit, she glided down the sandy beach to her clutch. She hovered over the eggs, making the most urgent and excited sounds. If the tide was coming in fast enough to endanger Menelly, it was also frighteningly close to swamping the nest. The little bronzes began to take up the queen's plaint, and several, greatly daring, flew about Menelly's head and then circled back to the clutch. I can come there now? You won't attack me? Melanie took a few steps forward. The tone of the cries changed, and Melanie quickened her step. As she reached the nest, the little queen secured one egg from the clutch. With a great laboring of her wings, she bore it upward. That the effort was great was obvious. The bronzes hovered anxiously, squeaking their concern, but being much smaller, they were unable to assist the queen. Now Menelaus saw that the base of the cliff, or saw that the base of the cliff at this point was littered with broken shells and the pitiful bodies of tiny fire lizards, their wings half extended and glistening with egg fluid. The little queen now had raised the egg to a ledge which Menelaus had not previously noticed, about a half dragon length up the cliff face. Menelaus could see the little queen deposit the egg on the ledge and roll it with her forelegs toward what must be a hole in the cliff. It was a long moment before the queen reappeared again. Then she dove toward the sea, hovering over the foamy crest of a wave that rolled in precariously close to the endangered clutch. With a blurred movement, the queen was hovering in front of Menelaus and scolding like an old aunt. Although Menelaus couldn't help grinning at the thought, she was filled with a sense of pity and admiration for the courage of the little queen, single-handedly trying to rescue her clutch. If the dead fire lizards were that fully formed, the clutch was near to hatching. No wonder the queen could barely move the eggs. You want me to help you move the eggs, right? Well, we'll see what I can do. Ready to jump back as she had mistaken the little queen's imperious command, Menelaus very carefully picked up an egg. It was warm to the touch and hard. Dragon eggs, she knew, were soft when first laid, but hardened slowly on the hot sands of the hatching grounds in the weirs. These definitely must be close to hatching. Closing the fingers of her damaged hand carefully around the egg, Menelaus searched for and found foot and handholds, and reached the queen's ledge. She carefully deposited the egg. The little queen appeared, the front talon resting proprietarily on the egg, and then she leaned forward towards Melanie's face, so close that the fantastic motion of the many-faceted eyes were clearly visible. The queen gave a sort of sweet chirp, and then, in a very businesslike manner, began to scold Melanie as she rolled her egg to safety. Melanie managed 3 eggs in her hand the next time, but it was obvious that between the onrushing tide and the startling number of eggs in the clutch, there'd be quite a race. If the hole were bigger, she told the little queen as she deposited 3 eggs, some of the bronzes could help you roll. The queen paid her no attention, busy pushing the 3 eggs one at a time to safety. Menelaus peered into the opening, but the fire lizard's body obscured any view. If the hole was bigger and the ledge consequently broader, Melanie could bring the rest of the eggs up in her carry sack, holding that she wouldn't pull down the cliffside and bury the queen, clutch and all. Menelaus prodded cautiously at the mouth of the opening. Loose sand came showering down. The queen took to scolding frantically as Menelaus brushed the rubble from the ledge. Then she felt around the opening. There seemed to be solid stone just beyond. Menelaus yanked away at the looser rock until she had a nice tunnel exposed with a slightly wider opening. Ignoring the little queen's furious complaints, Menelaus climbed down, unslinging her sack when she reached the ground. When the little queen saw Menelaus putting the eggs in the sack, she began to have hysterics, beating at Menelaus's head and hands. Now look here, Menelaus said sternly. I am not stealing your eggs. I'm trying to get them all to safety in jig time. I can do it with the sack, but not by the handful. Menelaus waited a moment, glaring at the little queen who hovered at eye level. Did you understand me? Melanie pointed to the waves more vigorously dashing up the small beach. The tide is coming in. Dragons couldn't stop it now. Melanie put another egg carefully in the sack. As it was, she'd have to make 2, maybe 3 trips or risk breaking the eggs. I take this, and she gestured up the ledge. Up there. Do you understand, you silly beast? Evidently, the little creature did, because crooning anxiously, she took her position on the ledge, her wings half extended and twitching as she watched Menelaus's progress up to her. Menelaus could climb faster with 2 hands, and she could carefully roll the eggs from the mouth of the sack well down the tunnelway. You'd better get the bronzes to help you now, or we'll have the ledge stacked too high. It took Menelaus 3 trips in all, and as she made the last climb, the water was a foot's width from the clutch. The little queen had organized her bronzes to help, and Menelaus could hear her scolding tones echoing in what must be a fair-sized cave beyond the tunnel. Not surprising, since these bluffs were supposed to be riddled with caverns and passages. Mentally gave a last look at the beach, water at least ankle deep on both ends of the little cove. She glanced upward past the ledge. She was a good halfway up the cliff now, and she thought she could see enough hand and footholds ahead. Goodbye, she was answered by a trill of chirps, and she chuckled as she imagined the scene. The queen marshaling her bronzes to position her eggs just right. Mentally did not make the cliff top without a few anxious moments. She was exhausted when she finally flopped on the sea grasses at the summit, and her left hand ached from unaccustomed gripping and effort. She lay there for some time until her heart stopped thudding in her ribs and her breath came more easily. An inshore breeze dried her face, cooling her, but that reminded her of the emptiness of her stomach. Her exertions had reduced the rolls in her pouch to crumbly fragments, which she gobbled up as fast as she could find them. All at once the enormity of her adventure struck her, and she was torn between laughter and awe. To prove to herself that she'd actually done what she remembered, she crept cautiously to the bluff edge. The beach was completely underwater. The sandy wallow where the fire lizard eggs had baked was being tide swept smooth. The rubble that had gone over the edge with her had been absorbed or washed away. When the tide retreated, all evidence of her energies to save herself and the clutch would be obliterated. She could see the protuberance of rock down which the queen had rolled her eggs, but not a sign of the fire lizard. The waves crashed with firm intent against the dragon stones when she gazed out to sea, but no bright motes of color flitted against the somber crags. Mentally felt her cheek. The fire lizard's scratch was crusted with dried blood and sand. So it did happen. However, did the little queen know I could help her? No one had ever suggested that fire lizards were stupid. Certainly, they'd been smart enough for endless turns to evade every trap and snare laid to catch them. The creatures were so clever indeed that there was a good deal of doubt about their existence, except as figures of overactive imaginations. However, enough trustworthy men had actually seen the creatures at a distance, like her brother Alamy, when he'd spotted some about the dragon stones, that most people did accept their existence as fact. Menely could have sworn that the little queen had understood her. How else could Menely have helped her? That proved how smart the little beast was. Smart enough, certainly, to avoid the boys who tried to capture them. Menely was appalled. Capture a fire lizard? Pen it up? Not, Menely supposed with relief, that the creature would stay caught long. It only had to pop between. Now, why hadn't the little queen just gone between with her eggs instead of arduously transporting them one by one? Oh, yes, between was the coldest place known, and cold would do the eggs harm. At least it did dragon eggs harm. Would the clutch be all right now in the cold cavern? Mentally peered below. Well, if the queen had as much sense as she'd already shown, she'd get all her followers to come lie on the eggs and keep them warm until they did hatch. Mentally turned her pouch inside out, hoping for some crumbs. She was still hungry. She'd find enough early fruits and some of the succulent reeds to eat, but she was curiously loath to leave the bluff, though it was unlikely that the queen, now her need was past, would reappear. Mentally rose finally and found herself stiff from the unaccustomed exercise. Her hand ached in a dull way, and the long scar was red and slightly swollen. But as Mentally flexed her fingers, it seemed that the hand opened more easily. Yes, it did. She could almost extend the fingers completely. It hurt, but it was a stretchy hurt. Could she open her hand enough to play again? She folded her fingers as if to a cord. That hurt, but again, it was a stretchy hurt. Maybe if she worked her hand a lot more. She had been favoring it until today when she hadn't given it a thought. She'd used it to climb and carry and everything. Well, you did me a favor too, little queen, Melanie called, speaking into the breeze and waving her hands high. See, my hand is better. There was no answering chirp or sound, but the soft whistle of the sea-born breeze and the lapping of the waves against the bluff. Yet mentally liked to think that her words had been heard. She turned inland, feeling considerably relieved and rather pleased at the morning's work. She'd have to scoot now and gather what she could of greens and early berries. No point in trying for spider claws with the tide so high. Who's up still? JJ, Daniel, Kimmy? Okay, Oh, hey, Dad. Hey, Becca. Hey, Granny Bear. Okay, chapter 5. O tongue, give sound to joy and sing of hope and promise on dragon wing. No one as usual noticed Melanie when she got back to the hold. Dutifully, she saw the harbor master and told him about the tides. Don't you go so far, girl, he told her kindly. Thread's due any day now, you know. How's the hand? She mumbled something which he didn't hear anyway as the shipmaster shouted for his attention. The evening meal was hurried, since all the masters were going off to the dock caverns to check tide, masts, and ships. In the bustle, Meneley could keep to herself, and she did, seeking the cubicle and the safety of her bed as soon as possible. There she hugged to herself the incredible experience of the morning. She was certain that the queen had understood her, just like the dragons. Fire lizards knew what was in the mind and heart of a person. That's why they disappeared so easily when the boys tried to trap them. They'd liked her singing, too. Mentally gave herself a squeeze, ignoring the spasm of pain in her now stiff hand. Then she tensed, remembering that the bronzes had been waiting to see what the queen would do. She was the clever one, the audacious one. What was it Petrion was always quoting? Necessity breeds solution. Did the fire lizards really understand people, even when they kept away from them? Then mentally puzzled again. Of course, dragons understood what their riders were thinking, but dragons impressed at hatching to their riders. The link was never broken, and the dragon could only hear that one person. So if Petrion had said, so how had the little queen understood her? Necessity? Poor queen, she must have been frantic when she realized that the tide was going to cover her eggs. Probably she'd been depositing her clutches in that cove for who knows how long. How long did fire lizards live? Dragons lasted the life of their rider. Sometimes that wasn't so long. Now the thread was dropping. Quite a few riders had been so badly scored they died, and so had their dragons. Would the little fire lizards have a longer life, being smaller and not in so much danger? Questions darted through Manali's mind, like fire lizards flashing, she thought, as she cuddled into the warmth of her sleeping fur. She'd try to go back tomorrow, maybe, with food. She rather thought fire lizards would like spider claws too, and maybe then she'd get the queen's trust. Or maybe it would be better if she didn't go back tomorrow. She should stay away for a few days then, too. With thread falling so often, it was dangerous to go so far from the safety of the hold. What would happen when the fire lizard eggs hatched? What a sight that would be! Ha! All the lads in the sea hold talking about catching fire lizards, and she, mentally, had not only seen but talked to them and handled their eggs. And if she were lucky, she might even see them hatching too. Why, that would be as marvelous as going to a dragon hatching at one of the weirs, and no one, not even Yanis, had been to a hatching. Considering her exciting thoughts, it was a wonder that Meneley was able to sleep. The next morning her hand ached and throbbed, and she was stiff from the fall and the climbing. Her half-formed notion of going back to the Dragonstone's Cove was thwarted by the weather, of all things. A storm had blown in from the sea that night, lashing the harbor with pounding waves. Even the dock cavern's waters were turbulent, and a wind whipped with such whimsical force that walking from hold to cavern was dangerous. The men gathered in the great hall in the morning, mending gear and yarning. Mavi organized her women for an exhaustive cleaning of some of the inner hold rooms. Meneley and Sella were sent down to the glow storage so often that Sella vowed she didn't need light to show her the way anymore. Meneley worked willingly enough, checking glows in every single room in the hold. It was better to work than to think. That evening she couldn't escape the great hall. Since everyone had been in all day, everyone needed entertainment and was going. The harper would surely play. Meneley shuddered. Well, there was no help for it. She had to hear music sometime. She couldn't avoid it forever, and at least she could sing along with the others. But she soon found she couldn't even have that pleasure. Mavi gestured to her when the harper began to tune his guitar, and when the harper beckoned for everyone to join in the choruses, Mavi pinched Meneley so hard that she gasped. Don't roar. You may sing softly as befits a girl your age, Mavi said, or don't sing at all. Across the hall, Sella was singing. not all accurately and loud enough to be heard in Brendan Hold, but when Menely opened her mouth to protest, she got another pinch. So she didn't sing at all, but sat there by her mother's side, numb and hurt, not even able to enjoy the music, and very conscious that her mother was being monstrously unfair. Wasn't it bad enough she couldn't play any more yet? But not to be allowed to sing? Why, everyone had encouraged her to sing when old Petrion had been alive and been glad to hear her, asked her to sing time and again. Then Meneley saw her father watching her, his face stern, one hand tapping not so much to the time of the music, but to some inner agitation. It was her father who didn't want her to sing. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. Obviously, they knew and were glad she hadn't come before. They didn't want her here. She wrenched herself free from her mother's grip, and ignoring Mavi's hiss to come back and behave herself, she crept from the hall. Those who saw her leave thought sadly that it was such a pity she'd hurt her hand and didn't even want to sing any more. Wanted or not, creeping out like that would send Mavi looking for her when there was a pause in the evening singing. So Meneley took her sleeping furs and a glow and went to one of the unused inner rooms where no one could find her. She brought her clothes, too. If the storm cleared, she'd be away in the morning to the fire lizards. They liked her singing. They liked her. Before anyone else was up, she had risen. She gulped down a cold claw and ate some bread, stuffed more in her pouch, and was almost away. Her heart beat fast while she struggled with the big metal doors of the hold entrance. She'd never opened them before and hadn't appreciated how very solid they were. She couldn't, of course, bar them again, but there was scarcely any need. Sea mist was curling up from the quiet harbor waters, the entrance to the dock, cavern visible as darker masses in the gray. But the sun was beginning to burn through the fog, and Meneley's weather sense told her that it would soon be clear. As she strode down the broad holdway, mist swirled up and away from the steps. It pleased Meneley to see something give way before her, even something as nebulous as fog. Visibility was limited, but she knew her path by the shape of the stones along the road and was soon climbing through the caressing mist to the bluff. She struck somewhat inland towards the first of the marshes. One cup of claw and a hunk of bread was not enough food, and she remembered some unstripped marshberry bushes. She was over the first humpy hill, and suddenly the mist had left the land and brightness of the sun, a spring sun, almost an ache to the eyes. She found her patch of marshberries and picked one handful for her face, then one for the pouch. Now that she could see where she was going, she jogged down the coast and finally dropped into a cove. The tide was just right to catch spider claws. These she would be a pleasant offering to the fire lizard queen, she thought as she filled her bag. Or could fire lizards hunt in fog? When Meneley carried her loaded sack through several long valleys and over humpy hills, she was beginning to wish she'd waited a while to do her netting. She was hot and tired. What are you getting at, Cat? Sorry, distracted. The cat is seeing things. Okay. Okay, everybody. She was hot and tired. Now that the excitement of her unorthodox behavior had waned, she was also depressed. Of course, it was quite likely that no one had noticed she'd left. No one would realize it was she who had left the hold doors unbarred, a terrible offense against the hold safety rules. Meneley wasn't sure why, because who'd want to enter the sea hold unless he had business there? Come all that dangerous way across the marshes for what? There were quite a few precautions scrupulously observed in the sea hold. Thank you, Anne McCaffrey, so many words. That didn't make much sense to Meneley, like the hold doors being barred every night and unshielded glows never being left in an unused room, although it was all right in corridors. Glows wouldn't burn anything, and think of all the barked shins that would be saved by leaving a few room glows unshielded. No one was likely to notice that she was gone until there was some unpleasant or tedious job for a one-handed girl to do. So they wouldn't assume that she'd opened the hold door. And since Menely was apt to disappear during the day, no one would think anything about her until evening. Then someone might just wonder where Menely was. That was when she realized that she didn't plan to return to the hold. And the sheer audacity of that thought was enough to make her halt in her tracks. Not return to the hold? Not go back to the endless round of tedious tasks of gutting, smoking, salting, pickling fish, mending nets, sails, cloths, cleaning dishes, clothes, rooms, gathering greens, berries, grasses, spider claws, not returning to tend old uncles and aunts, fires, pots, looms, glow baskets, to be able to sing or shout or roar or play if she so chose, to sleep. Ah, now where would she sleep? And where would she go when there was thread in the skies? Mentally trudged on more slowly up the sandy dunes, her mind churning with these revolutionary ideas. Why, everyone had to return to the hold at night. The hold, any hold, or cot or weir, 7 turns had thread been dropping from the skies, and no one traveled far from shelter. She remembered vaguely from her childhood that there used to be caravans of traders coming through the marshlands in the spring and the summer and early fall. There had been gay times with lots of singing and feasting. The hold doors had not been barred then. She sighed. Those had been happier times, the good old days that old uncle and the aunties were always droning on about. But once thread started falling, everything had changed for the worse. At least that was the overall impression she had from the adults in the hold. Some stillness in the air, some vague unease caused Mentally to glance about her apprehensively. There was certainly no one else about in this early hour. She scanned the skies. The mist banking the coast was rapidly disappearing. She could see it retreat across the water to the north and west. Toward the east, the sky was brilliant with sunrise, except for what were probably some traces of early morning fog in the northeast. It's about to get really exciting. Yet something disturbed Mentally. She felt she should know what it is. She was nearly to the Dragon Song stones now, in the last marshes before the contour of the land swept gently up towards the seaside bluff. It was as she traversed the marsh that she identified the odd quality. It was the stillness, not of wind, for that was steady seaward, blowing away the fog, but a stillness of marsh life. All the little insects and flies and small wrigglers, the occasional flights of wild wearies who nested in the heavier bushes were silent. Hi. Their myriad activities and small noises began as soon as the sun was up and didn't cease until just before dawn, because the nocturnal insects were as noisy as the daytime ones. It was this quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath, that was disturbing. Mentally, unconsciously, she began to walk faster, and she had a strong urge to glance over her right shoulder towards the northeast, where a smudge of gray clouded the horizon. A smudge of gray or silver? Mentally began to tremble with rising fear, with the dawning knowledge that she was too far from the safety of the hold to reach it before thread reached her. The heavy metal doors, which she had so negligently left ajar, would soon be closed and barred against her and thread. And even if she were missed, no one would come for her. She began to run, and some instinct directed her towards the cliff edge before she consciously remembered the Queen's Ledge. It wasn't big enough, really, or she could go into the sea. Thread drowned in the sea. She would see, so would she, for she couldn't keep under the water for the time it would take for Thread to pass. How long would it take the leading edge of the fall to pass over? She'd no idea. She was at the edge now, looking down at the beach. She could see the ledge off to the right. There was the lip of the cliff that had been broken under her weight. That was the quick way down, to be sure, but she couldn't risk it again and didn't want to. She glanced over her shoulder. The grayness was spreading across the horizon. Now she could see flashes against that gray. Flashes? Dragons? She was seeing dragons fighting Thread. their fiery breath charring the dreaded stuff mid-air. They were so far away that the winking lights were more like lost stars than dragons fighting for the life of Pern. Maybe the leading edge wouldn't reach this far. Maybe she was safe. Maybe seldom are, as her mother would say. In the stillness of the air, a new sound made itself heard, a soft rhythmic thrumming, something like the tuneless humming of small children, only different. The noise seemed to come from the ground. She dropped, pressing one ear to a patch of bare stone. The sound was coming from within. Of course, the bluff was hollow. That's why the queen lizard, on hands and knees, mentally scooted to the cliff edge, looking for that halfway ledge of the queen's. Mentally had enlarged the entry once. There was every chance she could make it big enough to squirm through. The little queen would certainly be hospitable to someone who had saved her clutch, and mentally didn't come empty-handed as a guest. She swung the heavy sack of spider claws around to her back. Grabbing handfuls of the grasses on the lip of the cliff, she began to let herself slowly down. Her feet fumbled for support. She found one toehold and dug half that foot in, the other foot prodding for another place. She slithered badly once, but a rock protrusion caught her in the crotch before she slipped far. She laid her face against the cliff, gulping to get back her breath and courage. She could feel the thrumming through the stone, and oddly, that gave her heart. There was something intensely exciting and stimulating about that sound. Sheer luck guided her foot to the queen's ledge. She'd risked only a few glances beneath her. The aspect was almost enough to make her lose her balance completely. She was trembling so much with her exertions that she had to rest them. Definitely the humming came from the queen's cavern. She could get her head into the original opening. No more. She began to tear at the sides with her bare hands until the thought of her belt knife, the blade, loosened a whole section all at once, showering her with bits of rock and sand. She had to clean her eyes and mouth of grit before she could continue. Then she realized that she'd gotten to sheer rock. She could get herself into the shelter only up to her shoulders. No matter how she turned and twisted, there was an outcropping that she could not pass. Once again, she wished she were small, as a girl ought to be. Stella would have had no trouble crawling through that hole. Resolutely, mentally began to chip at the rock with her knife, the blows jarring her hand to the shoulder and making no impression at all on the rock. She wondered frantically how long it had taken her to get down the cliff. How long did she have before Thread would be raining down on her unprotected body? She might not get past the bobble in the wall with her shoulders, but she reversed the position. Her feet, legs, hips, all right, up to the shoulders, passed through the safety of the solid rock. Her head was covered, but only just, by the cliff overhang. Did Thread see where it was going when it fell? Would it notice her, crowded into this hole as it flashed by? Then she saw the throng of the carry sack where she'd looped it over the ledge to keep it handy, but out of her way. If Thread got into the spider claws, she pulled herself far enough out of the hole to cast an eye above. No silver yet, no sound but the steadily increasing thrumming. That wouldn't have anything to do with Thread, would it? The carry sack thong had bitten into the ledge, and and she had a job freeing it, having to yank rather hard. The next thing she saw, the sack came free. The force of her pull threw her backwards, cracking her head on the roof of her tunnel, and then the surface beneath her buttocks started to slide out and down, mentally clawed her way into the tunnel as the ledge slowly detached itself from the face of the cliff and tumbled down onto the beach. Mentally scrambled back quickly, afraid more of the entrance would go, and suddenly she was in a cave, wide, high, deep, clutching the carry sack and staring at the greatly widened mouth. The thrumming was behind her, and startled at what she could only consider to be an additional threat, she whirled. Fire lizards were perched around the walls, clinging to rock spur and ledge. Every eye glinted at the mound of eggs in the sandy center of the cave. The thrumming came from the throats of all the little fire lizards, and they were far too intent on what was happening to the eggs to give any heed to her abrupt appearance. Just as mentally realized that she was witnessing a hatching, The first egg began to rock, and cracks appeared in its shell. It rocked itself off the mound of the clutch, and in hitting the ground split. From the two parts emerged a tiny creature not much bigger than Meneley's hand, glistening brown and creeling with hunger, swaying its head back and forth and tottering forward a few awkward steps. The transparent brown wings unfolded, flapping weakly to dry, and the creature's balance improved. The creel turned to a hiss of displeasure, and the little brown peered about defensively. The other fire lizards crooned, encouraging it to some action. With a tiny shriek of anger, the little brown launched itself toward the cave opening, passing so close to Meneley that she could have touched it. The brown fire lizard lurched off the eroded lip of the cave, pumping its wings frantically to achieve flight. Meneley gasped as the creature dropped, and then sighed with relief as it came into sight briefly, airborne, and flew off across the sea. More creeling brought her attention back to the clutch. Other fire lizards had begun to hatch in that brief period, each one shaking its wings, and then, encouraged by the weir mates, flopping and weaving towards the cave mouth, defiantly independent and hungry. Several greens and blues, a little bronze, and two more browns hatched and passed Meneley, and then, as she watched a little blue launch itself, Meneley screamed. No sooner had the blue emerged from the safety of the cliff than she saw the thin, writhing silver of thread descending. In a moment the blue was covered with the deadly filaments. It uttered one hideous shriek and disappeared. Dead or between? Certainly badly scored. Yes. Well, we can do that. We're almost done with this chapter. Go lay down. Glass of water. There you go. Yeah. Okay. Two more little fire lizards passed Meneley, and she reacted now. No, no, you can't. You'll be killed. She flung herself across their path. The angry fire lizards pecked at her unprotected face, and while she covered herself, made their escape. She cried aloud when she heard their screams. Don't let them go, she pleaded with the watching fire lizards. You're older. You know about thread. Tell them to stop. She half crawled, half ran to the rock where the golden queen was perched. Tell them not to go. There's thread out there. They're being killed. The queen looked at her, the many-faceted eyes whirring violently. The queen chuckled and chirped at her, and then crooned as yet another fledgling spread its wings and began to totter towards sure death. Please, little queen, do something. Stop them. The thrill of being witness to a hatching of fire lizards gave way to horror. Dragons had to be protected because they protected Pern. In Meneley's fear and confusion, the little fire lizards were linked to their giant counterparts. She turned to the other lizards now, begging them to do something, at least until the threadfall was over. Desperately, she plunged back to the cave mouth and tried to turn the little fire lizards back with her hands, blocking their progress with her body. She was overwhelmed with pangs of hunger, belly-knotting, gut-twisting hunger. It took her only a moment to realize that the driving force in these fire lizards was that sort of hunger. That was what was sending them senselessly forth. They had to eat. She remembered that dragons had to eat too when they first hatched, fed by the boys they impressed. Meneley wildly grabbed for her carry sack. With one hand, she snatched a fire lizard back from the entrance, and with the other, a spider claw from the sack. The little bronze screeched once and then bit the spider claw behind the eye, neatly killing it. Wings beating, the bronze lifted itself free of Meneley's grasp, and with more strength than Meneley would have thought the newborn creature could possess, flew its prey to a corner and began tearing it apart. Meneley reached out randomly now, and with some surprise found herself holding the one queen in the clutch. She snagged two spider claws from the sack in her other hand and deposited them and the queen in another corner. Finally realizing she couldn't hand feed the whole clutch, she upended the sack, spilling shellfish out. Newly hatched fire lizards swarmed over and after the spider claws. Meneley caught two more lizards before they could reach the cave mouth and put them squarely in the center of their first meal. She was busy trying to make sure that each new fire lizard had a shellfish when she felt something pricking her shoulder. Surprised, she looked up to find the little bronze clinging to her tunic. His round eyes were whirling and he was still hungry. She gave him an unclaimed spider claw and put him back in his corner. She tossed the little queen another and snared several and snared several other spider claws. Say that 10 times fast for her specials. Okay, come on. For her specials. Not many more of the newly hatched got out, not with a source of food so nearby. She'd had a fair haul in the sack, but it didn't take long for the hungry fire lizards to devour every last morsel. The poor things were still sounding starved as they creeled about, tipping over claws and body shells, trying to find any scraps overlooked. But they stayed in the cave, and now the older fire lizards joined them, nuzzling or stroking, making affectionate noises. Utterly exhausted, Meneley leaned back against the wall, watching their antics. At least they'd not all died. She glanced apprehensively at the entrance and saw no more writhing lengths of thread falling past. She peered further. There wasn't even a trace of the menacing gray fog on the horizon. Threadfall must be over, and not a moment too soon. Now she was experiencing hunger thoughts from all the fire lizards, rather overpowering, in fact, because she realized how hungry she herself was. The little queen, the old queen, began to hover in the cave, squeaking an imperious command to her followers. Then she darted out, and the old clutch began to follow her. The fledglings, moving awkwardly, made their virgin flight, and within moments the cave was empty of all but Meneley, her torn sack, and a pile of empty spider-claw fire lizard shells. With their exit, some of Meneley's hunger eased, and she remembered the bread she tucked in her pocket. Feeling a bit guilty at this belated discovery, she gratefully ate every crumb. Then she made herself a hollow in the sand, pulled the torn carry sack over her shoulders, and went to sleep. That is the end of chapter 5.
Yay.
We will read chapter 6 tomorrow. Give it to me.
What's the name of chapter 6?
It doesn't have titles, it's just chapters.
What's the first letter?
I'll tell you.
word.
Go lay down. I love you too.
Who's watching?
2 people, I don't know.
What, can you write the comments?
I don't know. Okay, go. Get in bed.
Okay. Can I get my water bottle?
I'll get it for you. Please stop interrupting. Go lay down.
I have a really bad headache.
Chapter 6 starts with the word Lord, and we will start that tomorrow. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Really have to go now and duct tape somebody. Good night.
No. Good night. Bye.